Now it's time to sit back and enjoy the session that consistently rates as one of the most popular of the ACSI conference, the Directors Panel. Today we are very fortunate to once again have a star-studded panel and it's going to be moderated by Michael Pascoe of Fairfax Media. So I'd ask Michael to come forward. Thank you.
Thank you, ACSI, for this chance to work with you today on what is a cracker Directors Panel, and the quality of the panel is in many ways, I think, a compliment and proof of the role that ACSI is increasingly playing for investors in Australia. The volunteers are coming forward to the panel as we speak. What I will do is give a very brief introduction to them, because all their biographies are so embarrassingly long and full of achievement that I always get narky about it. In brief, on my far left, actually I wonder if Kevin McCann's ever been called on anyone's far left before. On the far left, Kevin McCann, Chairman of Macquarie Group Limited, Macquarie Bank Limited, and Chairman of Citadel Group Limited. Alongside him, we have Simon McKeon, Chairman of AMP and CSIRO and Australian of the Year in 2011. Jane Hemstrich, Director, Commonwealth Bank of Australia, Tabcorp Holdings, Santos, Lend-Lease Corporation. And we are, of course, very mindful of diversity. Yes, Jane is not a lawyer. 75% of this panel are lawyers, and we've got to work on that, folks. We really do. And then next to me here is David Gonski, Chairman, ANZ Bank and Coca-Cola Amatil Limited, and he has been Chairman or Director of just about everything else that the other three members of the panel haven't been. So we've pretty much got the big end of town on the stage at one time. The way I like to give the panel a chance to start is to imagine that the fire alarm is about to go off in 5 minutes. So you're only going to get a chance to say one thing at this conference. So just a free kick to start with. Just an opening statement. If you could only get in with one blow at this panel session, David Gonski, what would it be?
Well, firstly, can I say I'd look where the exit is.
And you'd follow me because I run fast.
I think that what I would say is this, and particularly if I may say so to this august gathering, one of the things that has always troubled me as a director, and at least in the last 10 or so years, and particularly now, is in my opinion, our difficulty with determining whether we're prepared to invest for the long term or whether we're short-term investors. Now, the other day, and many of you would be aware of this, one of the biggest investors in the world wrote to all chairs. I'm sure Kevin definitely would have got one. And I was actually very happy to receive that letter. The essence of the letter was, we are long-term shareholders. We want you as the board to remember that you are here for the long term and shouldn't be deviated by quick in and out shareholders who want quick returns. When I have been on boards of Singapore companies, I think that's been their defining difference, that they look to the long term. Whereas here, we really have a bit of a paradox. We're very much judged on the short term, and we really need to think for the long term. So as I ran to the exit, I would say to all of you, many of whom are obviously involved in longer term funds, we need to hear at times from you, because the short termers talk all the time, either by selling or indeed by just sending us letters. Long-term shareholders are entitled to guide us, and I think long-term investment is a very important thing.
Thank you, David. A very sound point, and fits in well with a couple of the other issues that you've already been discussing today in terms of outcomes. Jane.
I'm going to talk my own book here a little bit. I worry a lot about technology, not just the technology platforms that my companies run on, but looking into the future and what technology means for the disruption of various business models. I think there's a lot coming at us from directions that we don't expect. And one of the jobs, I think, of a board is to try and look into the future a little bit and imagine what the future might look like. Because it's very difficult for a management team with its head always in the day-to-day to lift their heads and look with real depth at what the future might be, and imagine futures that frankly are not very appealing to you in your current mode of business. So I worry a lot about what's coming at us that we haven't seen, and what the shape of industries might look like in the future. And you have only to consider business models like Uber and Airbnb to know that there are things coming at us fast that we need to think about in the context of our own industries and how the shape of them might change.
Which is both a long and short-term problem facing boards. Thank you. Simon.
Well, Michael, for something completely different, I wanted to praise the organisers of today in relation to this emphasis on ESG, environmental, social and governance. The term has been around for a long, long time, and I can't remember when it first struck me as just simply being plain sensible. It was probably years and years ago that I said I desperately hope, out of a position of then very little knowledge as to whether it led to any outperformance, but I desperately hoped that there was something in it, simply because they were damn good principles as a human being. Forget the corporate scene. They were good things to subscribe for. And for me, it was very pleasing, actually. I think the initial evidence that I looked at over the years was essentially emanating out of North America. Very, very strong correlation, obviously, between those, what I will simplistically describe as good companies versus the others. And it was very encouraging to see. Not universal, of course, there were many exceptions, but it was good. I took the opportunity during 2011, Michael, you mentioned the very humbling year I had as Australian of the Year, and took every opportunity to not only tell corporate groups, but many others of this very strong message, which by that time was very much the subject of similar data here in Australia. And I certainly commend the Responsible Investment Association, I think, of Australasia for promoting that data. I think the issue for me going forward is simply one of caution, namely there's plainly an industry out there that manufactures the data, and as chairman of CSIRO and someone who's vitally interested in data, I hope that isn't actually obfuscating what the real facts are. The good news is, I think at this point, that it is strong, it is getting stronger. As someone involved with AMP, I'm delighted to emphasise that they have a very large group exclusively focusing on ESG, and in many respects trying to measure it with precision, rather than just rely on a company saying we're pretty good in this space, but coming up with their own view as to whether it's actually standing up to scrutiny.
Which also fits in very much with that longer term necessity, looking beyond the quarter. But look, trying to praise AXI, it won't make any difference. When we go to the floor, you'll still get very hard questions. You can rely on that. They're a hard bunch. Kevin.
Well, Michael, all of the points that my fellow panellists have made are matters of focus for me, but the fourth thing that I do spend time thinking about and focusing on is culture. That is the culture of our organisation. Because unlike my fellow panellists, we don't, at Macquarie, we don't have a franchise. We depend upon the intellectual innovation of our people. 30% of our business didn't exist 5 years ago. So we are constantly renewing what we offer to our community. So our mantra is really a very simple code of conduct, and that is opportunity, accountability, and integrity. So that's important for our business, but more and more regulators are focusing on culture and market behaviours. And a lot of the work following the GFC has been done by the Basel regulators, and now they're focusing on how we actually perform in the marketplace. And I suppose it's true to say that in the US and Europe, they are constantly being rocked by fresh stories and experiences of bad behaviour by people in the financial services industry. And so it's very important to see that we meet not only the regulators, our own expectations, the expectations of regulators, and very importantly the expectations of the community. So we need to be seen to be behaving in a way that's appropriate for our clients and that we're working for the benefit of our clients. So that would be my thought as I headed for the door.
Not that there are any fire alarms going off and we can all stay, because what happens next is I'm at the microphone, I get to go first, which is really good because I can't help myself. But then I will turn to you. This is your panel and the microphones will get to the floor, and you get to grill the victims, the volunteers on the panel for most of this session. Where to jump off from those subjects? Culture, regulation, Kevin. Whether it's a Penske file at one bank or other, or rogue traders discovered at others, or a financial planning system and individuals not doing the right thing, certainly that's been blamed on culture to a degree. What is the board's role in that? Does the buck stop at the board, and therefore have we seen massive board failure in financial institutions in this country?
I think the response to that, Michael, is that my CEO was at the Senate inquiry last month into this issue, and he acknowledged there had been shortcomings in relation to one of our divisions, the Macquarie Private Wealth Division, which deals with retail customers. And we recognised that through the enforceable undertaking with ASIC, and I can assure you, and if you read the transcript, he dealt in detail with the money we've spent in training our executives, our advisors, the money was spent on systems, and the money it was spent on compliance. So we recognise, along with management, that the companies need to do better. We are committed to that, and we're now moving forward, I believe, with a program that will give the advice that our clients are entitled to receive.
Which is what everyone says after they've been caught. I think that's a fair comment. Where is the culture in the first place in the institution? And I'm not picking on Macquarie here. It is, I think, every bank has managed to find something in the closet. Where does the board play a role in that culture?
Well, certainly the board accepts that we have an oversight role. We do not manage the company. We delegate management to people that we feel are competent. And as I said, we have acknowledged before the Senate that there were shortcomings in that advisory section, and we believe we have remediated that so we can go forward. So I think. Yes, you acknowledge the shortcomings and then you fix the problem. And that's what we believe we've done.
Our other three panellists, ANZ, Commonwealth Bank, AMP. It could be argued that a problem in the financial planning sphere is simply the structure of the industry. If it's vertically integrated, you are obviously going to have a problem. But you all have invested your companies have all invested billions of dollars in building a vertically integrated industry. Is that structurally flawed? Is it culturally flawed? Is it too big an issue for you to tackle? Don't all speak at once.
Michael, I think the good news is I'd like to speak. I'm not sure I'm going to answer that.
I did say he was a lawyer originally, didn't I?
No, but I felt quite strongly in the question to Kevin. Let me start by saying the banks, the big banks, are very big. By the way, I think it is wonderful that they're big. I think they're strong. That when I watched the Senate inquiry, and I didn't just do that so that I could see Nicholas Moore, I did that so I could see the ANZ person there as well. A few things came through my mind which are seldom spoken about, and as our shareholders here today and the people who have expectations of us, I hope they came to yours too. Firstly, the banks were there. Secondly, all of the banks, the five, if I may say, majors, have stood up, basically investigated the things, and will be there for their customers. The third thing is, I can't comment on Macquarie, I don't know the numbers, but Kevin would know them. We've got 52,000 people working at ANZ. I've got to confess to the audience, I haven't met all 52,000, but I've met a lot of them. And most of them are very fine people wanting to do the best not just for their customers, but for their company. And all I can say to you in terms of the board, it is culture, as I think Kevin really made it clear earlier, is a very important thing for a board. But if you say to me as chairman of a bank, it is my responsibility that no person will, act improperly, you can't do that. You can't do that in AXI, you can't do that in your own organisations. What's incumbent on you as a board member is to be awake and alive to the fact that there is a responsibility, and we accept that responsibility, and to put in as best you can the best systems, understanding and expectations to achieve that. And I just didn't want it to be left. There are such good people in all the banks. And the other thing that I find an irony is people sort of talk about banks and bash them in Australia. The Australian banks haven't taken any money from the public in terms of bailouts. They're there, they're strong, and they're there for their customers. And people criticise, we try and fix it. And believe me, our job as directors is to try and be on the front foot and do that. Now, just to touch on your question, because it's a very fair question. I mean, I was at ANZ when we bought the vertically integrated thing. I came back later. I strongly believed it was a good model. I still believe it's a good model, but I believe that basically we can always make models better, and we should work towards making sure that our own reputations are as unsullied and as strong as our employees and the investors here expect us.
Michael, can I just correct something factually? In the evidence that Greg Ward gave before the Senate, he pointed out Macquarie is not vertically integrated. We have a platform which has 105 different offerings, and we sell 1% through that platform of Macquarie product. So the rest of the product is my three colleagues here and the other, so if that's 105, my maths is there's 101 other products out there, probably people in this room. We are selling those products to our client. So we are, I'd like to dispel the view that we are part of that model. I'm expressing no view as to whether it's a good or bad model, but we have open architecture.
And perhaps if I can weigh in a little bit here on the issue of culture. Most organisations have a set of values that they say they espouse, and you can go into some organisations and see the list of values in a poster on the wall somewhere. That's absolutely no good unless they're also values in use. And there are ways that you can measure whether the values that people actually use every day in their day-to-day work are the ones that are the same as the poster. And there are various techniques. Most companies I'm involved with do various surveys of their employees, both on an annual basis and sometimes on a pulse basis. That gives you a sense of whether the values that are actually being used match the values on the wall. And it's incumbent on directors to keep a close eye on that. It is important to pay attention to what you're being told through employee surveys, and also to what you're being told when you go out and meet with employees. And I don't know all 45,000 of the Commonwealth Bank's employees any more than David knows all the ANZ employees, but you do get to meet them. And if you take the time to engage them in conversation, you learn how things really are at the coalface. And that's an important thing to do so that you can make your own judgment as to the state of the culture and whether anything needs to be addressed.
Was the Commonwealth Bank Board happy with the culture at the top level, the way the issue was initially handled when it hit the fan?
I think what you have to recognise with issues is what we know now is not what we knew then. These things unfold in stages, and you address them in stages. Had we known everything that we know now right from the get-go, we might have handled things in a different way, but we didn't. Evidence came to light in instalments, and we tackled the instalments as they arose. But I can't commend Ian Narev and his management team more warmly than is possible than to say they have committed themselves to doing a very thorough job of identifying all the problems and addressing them. It's a huge program, the Open Advice Review program, and it's because of management's commitment to absolutely get through all of this root and branch.
Okay, I'll move on. Being a shallow journalist, obviously I'd go for the headline scandal of the hour, but that is part of the licence to operate. It is part of the regulatory risk and the conundrum. Gerard Noonan was just outlining a conundrum for ACSI members on tax. As investors, yeah, pay as little tax as possible and give us the money. But from a social investor citizen point of view, there is another cultural issue. The tax debate in Australia at the moment. Do you think corporate Australia, as we've seen played out both homegrown and multinationals, have a cultural and licence to operate risk there that boards are still playing with?
Well, I'm the accountant, so I better pick up this issue to start with. The tax debate is characterised in the public arena by a very poor understanding of how corporate tax works. The idea that you pick up the profit line and apply 30% and that ought to be what's in the accounts as tax paid is naive. There's the whole issue of different jurisdictions that companies operate in and what the appropriate tax rate is there. There's the whole issue of allowable deductions for things like research that play into it. There's deferred tax. It's quite complex. Having said all of that, I think most of us haven't done as good a job as we could have at explaining the tax in the notes to the accounts. And I applaud the various organisations that are now moving towards doing a better and more comprehensive job of disclosure so it is easier to understand. I don't think many companies in Australia have deliberately sought to minimise their affairs in a way that risks reputation. I think they've sought to organise their affairs to pay the amount of tax they're legally required to pay. And you can't, I think, criticise people for complying with the law. If you don't like the amount of tax that people pay, change the law so that they pay some other rate of tax. Criticising people for not giving more in some moral capacity, I think, is flawed. None of us go into a supermarket and say, dairy farmers are disadvantaged, we ought to pay $2 for our milk instead of $1.19 or whatever it is. Why should you expect companies to voluntarily pay more tax than the law says that they should?
Michael, can I just add one thing, which seems to have been a little bit forgotten in the debate as well? For listed public companies that have large shareholder bases, it's actually in our interest to pay tax in Australia. The imputation system, I have sat on the board of a number of companies that have invested in operations overseas, and we've had to debate, can we continue 100% franking, which in the case of ANZ we can, and in the case of Coca-Cola Amatil, we're at 75%. Our investors in general prefer us to 100% frank. Most investors like dividends, which is their right in Australia. So the only point I'd add to, I think, exactly what Jane's saying, is that there is an incentive for the listed public companies to absolutely pay tax, not just to be good citizens, but to do the right thing in the franking credits available for their shareholders.
Which is a nice chance just to segue off to the side a little bit. Paul Keating's comments yesterday, the day before, very strongly in defence of dividend imputation, pointing out the conundrum of the anti-dividend imputation forces, which are massive and growing and very public at the moment. They're certainly there in the official family. That on one hand they're saying, oh, we've got to have lower company tax to attract foreign capital, but our franking system actually attracts a whole pile of domestic capital. From the point of view of bankers love domestic deposits. Do they also have a preference or a particular enjoyment of domestic equity owners for the same reason. Aside from being kept good citizens, do you think Keating's right or the Treasury RBA line of ditching dividend imputation is right?
Well, I'm happy to say, but I speak as myself because obviously on an issue like this, directors have different, not just on this panel, but round the boards that I'd sit on and others sit on. My own view is strongly in favour of the franking credit system, the imputation system. I've been around a long time. I remember what it was before, you'll remember that, and it put investment in shares in listed companies at a disadvantage. Where I may differ with Paul Keating is the question of what it is doing to companies that genuinely want to take our technologies, our thinking, into outside of Australia. And obviously, basically, if you invest overseas, pay tax overseas, you can't give that as a franking credit. I would love people to look at that. I think in listening to Paul's comments, which as usual are clever and well thought through, I'm not sure he would do that. In fact, he said it was gall to ask for it. I think I'd take the gall and ask for it. I would also say to you that of course there is a place for deposits, that's very important, but I think that the system has worked well for us, the imputation system, and I'd be sad if it was taken away.
As would I.
Yeah, Michael, I'd just make a couple of comments on foreign investment. Yes, we do like foreign investors in our registers, but once you hit 40%, you become a foreign company, and that puts an Australian company at a huge competitive disadvantage. And so we need to think through the implications of that, particularly an area which government is being somewhat schizophrenic about. One, they want us to invest in agricultural and livestock projects, but they have imposed very tough guidelines for foreign investors in that sector. So if you go over the 40%, you really do have problems, and you have the people in this room are probably familiar with the difficulties that are emerging in managed investment schemes, where we want to attract foreign capital to get scale in this business, but we find that we are subject to a competitive disadvantage. In terms of deposits, frankly, if you're a depositor, I don't know what the Reserve Bank is going to do today, but if you're a depositor, as you know, overseas, you actually now pay for your money to be deposited. So JP Morgan will not take deposits anymore. And so deposits are not a very attractive return for Australian investors, and frankly, we can borrow more cheaply offshore.
Just on the supermarket thing, a thought occurred. People do go into the supermarket and pay more for eggs that aren't battery farmed.
Correct. I do that.
So maybe investor citizens would think more. And Simon, fitting in with your ESG hat, is there a culture there that is perhaps stronger than a pure bottom line in terms of assessing where to put money?
Of course there is, Michael, but sorry, the culture where?
Among investors in this room and who they represent, for a start.
Sure. The world is full of people with diverse interests, and there's a range of those of us that think of nothing else other than the financial return, through to the other end of the spectrum where it's different. And the important thing about our markets is that they ought to offer that choice. And I think here in this country we have a way to go, but if you're so minded, it's not that hard to find the right place to invest on a basis that you're happy with.
Financial institutions, banks, have been targeted over their investment in carbon, over their lending to fossil fuel companies. Is that reasonable? How do you respond to it? Where do you stand on it?
As far as I'm concerned, I think there have been a number of interesting stories in recent years. I'll just mention one, which many of you will be familiar with, being the ANU decision not so long ago. And You know, I've got to say it was a heroic decision to make. I think, you know, for my part, I didn't agree with it. It went far too wide. But having said that, Michael, I am one that has no problem with feisty public debates about where, especially money that is managed on behalf of a group of workers working in a similar place, ought not to be aired publicly. In fact, I don't think we have talked enough about where our money is invested, and I'm going to highlight someone in the room today who's doing a wonderful job, Dr. Bronwyn King, one of our best oncologists from Melbourne, and she is basically waging a war about you know, whether we ought to be investing in tobacco companies or not. And I credit the industry funds for having actually led the way thus far. But, you know, these are sometimes uncomfortable issues. Of course they're uncomfortable. But the good news is we essentially live in a nation of free speech. And it's good to get these issues out. It's good to understand really what we're dealing with. Yep, some of it's going to be uncomfortable. Some of it will place people like me in positions of conflict and left brain, right brain. But all I know is if we don't have these discussions honestly, we really will, you know, continue to live in the dark ages.
As somebody who was on the receiving end of the ANU issue, I'm very much in favour of what you talk about, the good, honest debate, but I would underscore the word honesty here. I'm very keen on things that are data and fact driven, not just confined to 140 characters in the short-term cycle. If we are going to have a debate, I think we need to have a factual debate and do it based on good research and good analysis. And I think some of that was conspicuously lacking in the data set that the ANU made its decision on, unfortunately. But let's have the debate, let's bring it on, let's discover what we all think as investors and as a country about being basically, in some large degree, a resources-based economy. It has implications for us all.
Michael, can I add, I mean, I'd actually pick up both the points that we made earlier, which is it's good to have debate, and there's no doubt about it. And in answer to your question about what do the boards do, we also debate it, and so we should. And I think the discussion and what's gone on in recent time about fossil fuels has, of course, made that issue more important, and we've discussed it. The difficulty I have, and I assume my panel members would agree with me, is usually people putting up these issues have a solution. And sometimes life is not quite as, forgive the pun, black and white as basically they're putting. In the case of ANZ, we've obviously also had a lot of fossil fuel discussion, and we're strong in helping renewables. That's the way we see it, that we should move towards the new technology. Many of us, including myself, and I don't speak for the company, I'm speaking for myself here, believe that the fossil fuels do employ a lot of people, give a lot of light and electricity to people who wouldn't have it without it. I can't turn the switch and just put them into darkness. But I am, I hope, as most board members are and people who run big companies, we've got consciences, we should work towards something. So I just put to you that sometimes it's not just pointing out the issue, it's being open to the solutions that may be available.
Is there a tipping point in a boardroom? Tobacco was mentioned. Most people are out of tobacco. Turns out the tobacco industry has been the most successful industry to invest in. Anyway, is there a tipping point between a ginger group of hardcore lobbyists on any issue, whether it's carbon or analysts wanting this quarter's profit to be extraordinarily good and not caring about the next? Is there a tipping point in the board that you feel the pressure on? To what extent does the board reflect society, is led by it, listens to groups such as ACSI?
I find that a very easy question to answer, Michael. The answer is yes. You know, if anyone thinks that boards really nowadays do live in ivory towers and not connected to the wider community, then I would just challenge it. I've never come across such a board in recent years, and indeed, I think one of the reasons why the number of board meetings or the length of time they take, reality is typically directors are spending more time together, is because of this very point. There are many things put up to boards that are simply not approved in a few minutes. And most importantly, we'll probably get on to diversity of boards in a while, but of course diversity, which is a wonderful thing, means the discussion is often longer and deeper because of that divergence of views that comes to the table. Honestly, I think boards are working harder than they ever have before. I don't need any sympathy because it's a great environment to be in, to struggle with these issues, which are real world issues. But no, I suspect that if anyone thinks that these are kind of pre-agreed issues that come to the board, particularly the ones you've just mentioned, far from it.
And I think the word you used was listened. Of course we're aware of us shareholders and stockholders and all of the stakeholders. We must be. I've said in speeches over the years, I remember the boardrooms of the past never had windows. I've noticed boardrooms have windows now, and that's not because of our union of directors. That's because we're meant to look outside, and I really believe strongly in that. But the point I want to make is this, that I believe being on a board is not a popularity contest. And if it becomes a popularity contest, well, I think it's going to be pretty grim. And by the way, coming back to short-term, long-term, we'll probably all move very short-term because we've got a 3-year term, usually, people won't wait to see what we're doing to vote us back. So we have to make decisions. Bronwyn's name was mentioned earlier. When I was on the Future Fund, she played a big part in the decision we made not to invest or to decide not to invest in cigarette manufacturers. Why? Comes back to Jane's point. She had the facts. We were able to get our own consultants to look at the facts. It wasn't just an emotional response. And we felt as a board that that was right after a lot of debate.
There are a whole pile of other issues I'd like to touch on before taking the microphone to you, as it's your conference, not mine. But there are a couple I've just got to get in. Jane, you mentioned technology at the outset, particularly given the importance and the big dollars involved for the financial institutions on the technology front, on the IT spend. How well equipped are boards to actually make decisions on it? Or do they end up captured by a couple of consultants in the same way that the superannuation industry is really pretty much run by a couple of asset consultants? He said quickly and moved on.
And moved on very, very swiftly. I think what stands most boards in good stead is the ability, without feeling self-conscious about it, to ask the simple but hard questions. We're paying how much for what? What exactly is this going to do for us? And you can ask those kinds of questions without needing to be a deep technology expert. I do think boards, though, are enhanced by having people on them, talking my own book again, who do know something about technology and can ask more detailed questions. But when it gets right down to it, it's the same simple but hard questions which will get you to the heart of what it is you need to know. The other thing I would make as a point about technology is you have to understand your ecosystem. It's not just the technologies, it's the companies that are providing it, the nature of the relationships that you have with them, and what they're going to do for you. You need to understand that whole ecosystem to really get yourself comfortable around matters of technology.
So those lawyers are a dead waste, basically. That's what you're saying in the boardroom, right? Pretty much?
I wouldn't be quite so definite, but...
Lawyers, Michael, are very adaptable people. And we're adaptable because technology is forcing us to be adaptable. Let me give you a case study, which is the securities industry. The wallet for the securities industry in Australia has shrunk by about 33%, and it's still shrinking. Why? Because clients now don't actually ring us up and place orders. They trade on our platforms. And whereas once upon a time we might have got 30, 40, 50 basis points, now we're lucky if we get 5 or 6 basis points. So the securities industry in Australia, like the securities industry globally, is absolutely being transformed. So the thing we know what we don't know, but the challenge is what is it that we don't know and is going to happen to us in the future. And I take my board away every year. I have a chairman's visit, and we invariably visit someone like Microsoft or Google. And a lot of it, of course, is salesmanship. Some of it's cutting edge stuff. And so you can get people who are lawyers or McKinsey experts or management consultants or whatever else we've got on the board. Those people are smart people. They've got a good learning curve, and we understand what it is we don't know, and you recruit people to your business who really can explain in non-technical terms what's required for the company in order to meet this disruption. And frankly, we welcome disruption. We're the innovator. We're the little guy fighting these big guys over here. So we like being disruptive.
Michael, can I just, because you've raised an issue which I'm sure a lot of people in the audience have a view on, but I thought I'd pop it in. I'm actually against subject matter experts being appointed to boards unless they're generalists. And I want to make it clear that if I was put on a board because I'm a lawyer, that would be a disaster for the company and probably the legal profession. The fact is, and I think this is what Kevin was saying, that what we should be looking for on our boards are people who've got some experience, people who've got open minds, people who are prepared to listen and delineate, and people who have an understanding. I think it's a very important thing they understand the basics of companies. But I've sat on boards with subject matter experts, and it's not a good feeling when it comes to account time or whatever, when they look at you, and that is not vindicated when you see the beautiful and genius they have when you're about to buy or commit to an IT system. You need a team on a board, and that team has to display generalist qualities with obviously the diversity and background of each director. Now, that doesn't mean you have to get consultants. You could have people on committees, for example, that have this expertise. But I just warn, because I know a lot of people are thinking of it, just taking people who have one claim to fame is a big mistake. And by the way, much easier for us, because when, God forbid, something goes wrong on IT, I'll blame them.
Look, there are just two last areas I want to touch on before taking the microphone to the floor. One is that diversity issue that you were sort of referring to. For all that excellent sentiment that chairmen have, if you look at boards, you can pretty much tick off, yeah, they'll have a lawyer and they'll have a former head of one of the big accounting firms, and they will have, hopefully they'll have someone who actually understands the industry in. Some boards famously haven't and have paid the price for it. Isn't there still a lot of box ticking in terms of the qualities of people who you appoint to your boards?
I would argue there's not enough box ticking. You know, Michael, I went to a school in an earthy industrial part of Melbourne, and it had 50 different ethnicities, and I just thought it was normal, that was life. And as time went on, I ended up in a more monocultural place, to be perfectly honest. And I really missed those formative years where, afternoon tea would be tasting cakes that had, been invented in some other part of the world, etc., etc., etc. And I think there has been a time past where we were simply far too, monocultural. The issue for me right at the moment is diversity is so much bigger than gender, so much bigger than gender. And whilst gender is a story, thanks to people on this podium, I think it's absolutely going in the right direction. That's plain. Is it fast enough? No. But for goodness sake, it's only the start of the journey. Boards, by and large, in this country are too similar. My own pet interest in some respects is the area of science. We have so few PhDs on boards, and that's just a numbers game. Just count them up on our top 100 boards relative to the top 100 in other parts of the world. And there are many other deficiencies that we have on our boards. I think the most important thing is it's not a crisis. Let's do it in a measured way. But as each nominating committee gets together and appoints who is going to be the next person to replace someone who's been on the board, plainly ensuring that group of team players with divergence experiences, gender, geography, discipline, the list goes on and on, is actually first and foremost. The best discussions I've ever had are when people much more informed and cleverer than me add to the discussion. The worst discussions are when I learn nothing.
Michael, could I say also that Australia is really fortunate with its ethnic diversity. Macquarie's like the United Nations. When I go up and down on the lift, and we've got a very collaborative building, the old Commonwealth Bank building, and we've converted into something where you cannot help but meet someone every day who you haven't met before. It is the United Nations. I've just come back from the Gulf, and the guy who was heading that organisation is a young man who was an Iranian, born in Iran, left Tehran a number of years ago, was a boy genius at David's University, did a maths degree at 16 to 18, and he is now running our Middle East office, and he's now been moved to run our whole of Asia Pacific and the Middle East. Now he cannot wait to go to Iran when it opens up, because he wants to go back to his home country. That office has one person like me in it, a Anglo-Saxon, Caucasian or Irish background. The rest of them are from all over the ethnic pattern platform, and we realise that these are the people we have to recruit. It's absolutely great having an Australian Chinese Mandarin speaker who's got our culture leading teams in China. So we haven't quite got the diversity of ethnicity yet on our boards. We're working away on gender, and I think the big end of town in Australia has done a good job there. But watch this space. It's going to happen, like a lot of things in life, very quickly.
Yep.
And you'll get the PhDs that my other little company, Citadel, has. My CEO has 2 PhDs, almost too many. But he's an instance of the new breed. So it's going to come, and I think it will be faster than we think.
Very quickly, we had the launch here this morning of the 30% Club of Australia. Easy, simple question to you. Would you sign up your boards? 30% gender diversity?
Easy answer, yes.
Already have.
We're there.
Done. That was easy. This is where I take the microphone to the floor and do my Jerry Springer impersonation, sort of. Catch my eye. Could we have the house lights up a little bit, please? Put up your hand, wave, kick me, preferably wave, and I will get it to you. My first questions are right here. Just while I'm on the way with the handheld microphone to that first question, we're told that there's a wave of M&A happening any day now. As soon as Australian business discovers its animal spirits, cheap money, you're all going to go out and take over things. The history of M&A, of CEOs getting bigger pay packets by taking over and becoming a bigger company, hasn't been too good at the bottom line. Does that concern you as directors, as chairman? The coming wave of M&A, is it going to happen? Do you think you're going to get it right this time?
Well, I don't think it's going to affect many of us on this panel, because except as advisors. It's very hard for anyone to take over one of the big 4 banks. That's not permitted. I can't imagine the AMP being taken over, and Macquarie, I can't see it. So we're looking forward to advising CEOs to make prudent and sensible M&A decisions.
And the only thing I'd add, having been in the advisory business many years ago, next year the M&A activity is going to be greater than this year.
Always. Always. We've had 30 years of it.
Yeah. On the floor.
Thank you very much. Blair Palese, I work on divestment, fossil fuel divestment for 350.org. So thank you for the question. My question, I think on behalf of myself, but also all this room, how would you recommend we best engage on a difficult, Jane, you mentioned, let's have that debate. What's the best way and suggestions for us to engage with you, with boards, with the key decision makers in this country? We're not getting policy change. So one of the reasons the divestment campaign has taken off so much is that people are frustrated and looking for ways to have an influence on climate change. So we'd love your suggestions and advice about how to engage successfully to have a good outcome that helps everyone, the economy, the environment, et cetera, jobs.
Well, I'll have a go. Look, great question. Many things to do. Actually, just starting with the laws of the land. I come from Victoria. I think actually the rules are similar here. Very hard to get a wind farm up. Unacceptably hard, I would argue. And so, let's not start with the funds flow and the investment decisions. Let's start with just the rules about what can and can't be done. I wear a CSIRO hat. One of the inexplicable things, I just can't understand this, is that CSIRO has been working diligently with the main coal seam gas producers in Queensland for years. Clearly, it got off to a poor start. Bad things happened. But the reality is that that's now years ago. And I would argue and defy anyone to suggest that the collaborative arrangements up there with CSIRO and these major producers haven't been anything but good. But having said all that, and I'm the first to note that it is still work in progress. It's not as if we know the totality of the science. Of course we don't. That program continues. And every now and then there are tough discussions between the CSIRO scientists and the industry players. But all I'm saying is that I think that it's a mature arrangement that has persisted well, but we haven't seen that occur again in the other major eastern states. So there is much to do before we even get to unlocking the funds, if you like. But the only thing I'll end up on is to emphasise what David said a little while ago. Too often a campaign is about shutting things down, and David put it so well that this is about transition, not shutting down in a hurry. And I can't think of many people I know that have a problem with sensible transition, which means, of course, increasing the rate of investment in new energy as opposed to old. But I have a lot of friends who just don't understand the overnight shutting down philosophy. But look, I commend you for the work you're doing. It's very important. We go through eras where it's much harder than it ought to be. But the reality is that, this is happening. We're not doing enough in this part of the world, and we probably need to catch up.
Could I just add a footnote to that? In another life, I used to chair Origin Energy. And the frustrating thing for us was that there was no settled policy in the field. You might recall the Howard government proposed cap and trade. The Rudd government had a carbon tax. The present government has repealed that. We had a RET, which we all thought was 20% renewables. It turned out it was a hardwired number. It ended up being north of 30. Other countries have had more settled programs, and putting on the Macquarie hat, we are big investors in wind farms in Germany and in the United Kingdom and Scotland, and we've got solar investments in the United States. So in other countries we seem to have a more mature approach to policy. I think the debate here has become really heated, and my counsel is there was a very good guy from Princeton who came out a few years ago and gave a speech on climate change. And his point is, let's not demonise direct action or cap and trade. You can have both systems. In America, direct action worked in the case of motor vehicle emissions, and cap and trade worked for other markets. So my view would be to keep up the work. I'm a personal supporter. Keep up the good work. Let's try and have the debate less theological and better as a scientific debate, and let's have some compromise rather than as Simon said, shut it down, or as David said, there's only one solution. And sometimes a compromise is a good way forward.
Victoria doesn't like CSG, doesn't like wind farms. Brown coal's great. Another question.
Yeah, it's Ross Youngman, Ausbil Investment Management. I'd just like to explore, David, your point about short-term, long-term sustainability of businesses. We're sometime now past 2008. We saw what happened back there. We had Chuck Prince City was talking about, as long as the music's playing, we're going to get up and dance. We saw Lehman, we saw what happened at Babcock, some of the companies here. You've got new CEOs. We've seen today that 98% of them are male, they're testosterone driven. They want to make their mark. They've got 3 to 5 years. We saw Brian Hartzer today come out with the Westpac announcement, increasing capital, slowing dividend growth. How do you sort of balance as a board that interaction with your CEO about when is the right time to take your foot off the pedal? How do you actually balance up the cycles versus the competitive short-term nature of the media cycle and the analysts, as we know, and how do you get that right?
I think the answer to that is with great difficulty. I mean, you've raised an excellent point. And, you know, having thought about it for so many years, I think it is such a mixture. I mean, one of the things that I believe as a director is that one must be attuned or have the ability to be attuned to what is expected of one. And that obviously sometimes varies, and often one's appreciation of it varies with different people around the board. I feel very, very strongly that we have an obligation as directors to the ongoing survival and hopefully great profitability of our companies. And I'm very scared that with this great yearn in the marketplace for yield, that basically we've never been at a bigger tipping point in terms of the short term versus the long term. And I deliberately mentioned it earlier because there's so many people in this room who can make a difference. Because as advisors and shareholders in the big companies, if you make it clear that what you're really looking to is the fact that you're funding retirements or whatever in 30 years, and you expect us to also have an eye to that, that's very important to us. As to the balance between us, the CEO, the chairman and the CEO, this is also, you know, more an evolution than an art. But I have to say, I wouldn't lie awake for ages about the newness of the CEOs, whether they're male or female on that score. I mean, it obviously tells a story in the fact that it is so dominantly male, which we have to change over time. But the one thing I would say to you is, I think the days of boards being totally led by their CEO are yesterday. Boards are much stronger, and by the way, the shareholders have helped us, ironically, to get there. And I think our job is to make sure that there are no deviations from what's right because somebody wants to star for 10 minutes.
Another question from the floor, over on the wall.
Jack McCartney from UniSuper. My understanding of your the financial services companies you work for you represent, I should say, is that you currently take commission on insurance, and you also get insurance on funds under management. My question to the panel is, if you're in the position where you're advising a family member who is about to get financial advice, would you advise them to see an advisor who receives commission or who is paid on a fee-for-service basis, and your reasoning for the advice?
I think that's probably an AMP type question.
Well, I'll start. I'd advise neither. I'd advise that they simply need to start by, in a market full of choice, getting the person that they believe is going to connect with them, understand their objectives, talk in language they understand, give advice that seems sensible. And yep, the reality is in this nation we have enormous choice as to who that advisor is going to be. Some will be truly independent, operating either as sole business people or in a small partnership, through to others being part of a very, very large organisation. And as far as I'm concerned, yes, there are different fee regimes, etc., etc. But I honestly start by saying there's something far more important than that. Plainly, I have no interest in myself getting advised by someone who is so caught up in the fee regime or whatever the process is that they're plainly not giving you the right advice. Clearly not. But I guess if the point of your question is, can one justify, this so-called vertically integrated structure, my view is that we can. The reality is that, as with everything, there are pluses and minuses with each of these different types of advisors. The reality is that most harm has been done in the last few years, not by advisors that were some way linked, whether by employment or franchise arrangements with a large vertically integrated group. They actually haven't done much harm as far as the entire nation is concerned. Most has been done by, larger independent groups that went belly up in recent years. But again, for my part, that doesn't really tell me anything anyway. At the end of the day, it is a personal relationship. Each one of us probably has relationships with all sorts of fiduciaries, whether they're solicitors, accountants, etc., etc. And most importantly, we need to ensure that they are giving us the advice that is right for us.
On the floor.
Greg Nolan, Care Super. I just wanted to get back to the financial planning issues that we've discussed. As shareholders, major shareholders in each of the companies, what sort of reaction do you expect from our boards, given what's now come to press? And I guess the other question I was sort of thinking, if you're a trustee director, how would you react?
Well, look, I'm happy to go first because there'll be no victory in answering this question. It's a very good one. But if I can just say to you that I think as directors, the first thing you would do is to basically seek balance in what you're actually reading. I think that, as I said, and you'd expect me to say it, but I believe it, the banks were there. They didn't run away. They came, they spoke at the Senate. They're there, hopefully will be there for hundreds. I mean, my bank's 180 years old. I just wanted to make sure that the new one knew that. I know you may say you're older, but the fact is that we're there. So that's the first thing. If your directors are thinking, well, has the board of the investor company, the bank, let us down? I think you've got to examine in your own things, how do your board work? If you believe that we are closing our eyes to it, and I speak, by the way, as somebody who's only been there for a year, so I'm lucky. I can sort of look back and say it wasn't my fault, unless you go back 7 years. But the fact of the matter is that boards have a lot to consider, and boards who close their eyes, you should get rid of. But boards who are trying, and I do feel Kevin expressed it in terms of the culture, trying to sort it out, I think they should be given, not accolade, but they should be given time to do it.
If I could just do a follow-on note, I really would urge you to read the transcript of Nicholas Moore and Greg Ward, and you'll get a perspective that perhaps you haven't seen elsewhere. We have paid out $9.5 million in compensation. We wrote to 187,000 people. We got 800 responses, and we're working our way through those cases. And we're working through a program which is agreed to by the Financial Ombudsman. So I think as I said, if you read the evidence of my chief executive before the Senate, you'll see that a very thorough job is being done to compensate those people that need to be compensated. You'll get a perspective about the scale of the issue, which you may not have got elsewhere, and then you'll draw your own conclusions as to whether your investment in the company is a sound one or not.
Question from the very back of the room.
Hi, is this on? Michael Chandler from GPS Proxy. Sometimes for those of us who work in corporate governance advisory, we oftentimes find it difficult to assess the quality of directors. The ASX Corporate Governance Council has recently issued a recommendation that companies disclose a board skills matrix or an accompanying narrative. What are your perceived advantages or disadvantages of that disclosure, and taking into account potential public scrutiny around that?
I think most boards have a skills matrix. Whether they disclose it or not is a different question. Whether it will tell you a whole lot more than the resumes that you see in the annual report, I don't know. But by and large, I think if people are interested and they want that disclosure, I don't have a problem with it. It could be a very positive thing.
And can I just, in support of what I said earlier about this popularity thing, I mean, I see a board as a team, and absolutely the shareholders have a vital interest in what that team is, and it is their right to vote us on and off as they wish. But I do think in general, if I were an investor solely, and I have been in some of my roles, I'm interested in the team, not necessarily the individuals. And by the way, if I see that team is made up just of one type of person, that scares me, a la what Kevin was saying earlier. But if it's got a diversity, that's a plus. If there are some people there that perhaps don't have the skills that I might think they have, if others do, provided everybody, as I said, is a team in general, delighted. So I'd just put that too. It's a difficult thing to actually know what's going on in the boardroom, and I think it's important that we don't open it up to being a popularity campaign, because basically it'll then become basically an election type thing, and I think you will lose a lot of people in that round.
Can I just end up by saying I'm not sensing any one of the four of us running away from this important question. The issue is, how really do people like you get to the bottom of it? And all I would say is that I think that in your particular position, the skills you have, particularly talking to senior management, you will ask questions and get the answers you are looking for. The reality is that some boards are better than others, plainly. And I suspect that the people that know that most are the ones that are working with them, the senior management. And I'm in no way intimidated or concerned about people asking senior management that I am involved with about my performance or the performance of the team, as David emphasises. It's a good thing to know, and frankly, I've had one or two comments over the years saying your team could be a little bit better. They've been put constructively, and some of the most valuable comments that I've ever had.
And while we're down the back of the room.
This one's for David Gonski. Vas Kolesnikov from ISS Governance, David. I have, I've been looking at the financial system and financial services providers. Over the last 5 years and for the last 100 years, the banks have been growing in prominence, and they've also grown in prominence as to where they sit in the index as well. Now, looking at all the financial services providers, recently they seem to have all had quite substantial issues with dealing with consumers. I think that seems to be quite clear. From a board perspective, and prefacing with what David Thirty said last week about the executive remuneration issues and how you justify it, when you have an issue from an ESG perspective, you're dealing with the farmers after you've bought the Landmark loan book. How does the board get involved in these things, and from a reputational issue, try to combat the executives from saying, okay, look, we need to develop a policy here of how we deal with consumers, how we avoid conflicts of interest in terms of fees, how we deal with, we've just bought a loan book and we don't wind all these people up because that's a reputational issue. This to me seems like it overlaps from a remuneration perspective, because there's always this short-term drive for my bonus and pay and driving the share price. I'm interested in in how the board is now looking at ESG issues and dealing with investors, because we all have in this room account holders of people managing money here that are part of the client base of your institutions. And some of them aren't overly happy. And I see the prominence of the banks as being quite out there, and the boards need to control these things. And I'm a bit concerned how that's been managed at the moment from a reputational issue.
That's a very good question, as you always give us good questions. But I think I'd give you this reassurance. The first thing is, I believe the modern board, and that's the board of the last 5 to 8 years, as recently as that, is very attuned to ESG issues and to the fact that, as people call it, that you need a license to operate. I mean, let me tell you, I've been around now for 38 years. 38 years ago, I was advising companies that did not care what happened as long as they made profit. I've watched that just in my lifetime, and it is very strongly happening. The second thing I would say to you is boards responding to something that's already got out is ironically much easier than the other thing which we have to do, which is to improve things before things happen. So taking the things, responding to what's already out there, whether it be the farming thing that you mentioned or whatever, as a board we have the ability, and we do, to ask for explanations, to question, to look at the bonus arrangements, both going forward and indeed to test the remuneration for the payments in that period, etc., etc. And I can tell you, and I'm sure I speak for the others here, we do that. And that is an unfortunate thing that something's happened, but it is quite easy for boards to buy in after the event. The thing that I'm always wary of, and I've got a feeling all of us are, is how do you be a step ahead? How do you make sure the culture is such that things like the things you talk about don't happen? And that is really, really difficult in any large group of people, let alone companies. I certainly obviously believe the ANZ tries hard and does well, but I believe my colleagues in the other 4 others plus us, 5, and maybe all of the banking thing, but we're all attuned to it and we're all trying. And all I can give you as a reassurance is this is on the minds of the directors today. We don't want to do the wrong thing. Everybody round the table wants to do the right thing. But obviously, things happen. And just final thing, you rightly said the banks have had all this negativity and so on. An AGSM, another plug for my university, PhD student, came to me, he's doing a thing on the top 25 companies, and he hasn't found one that doesn't have some sort of saga or problem in the last 3 years. And his explanation, social media.
Michael, can I just go on from David's point about the fact that things have changed? I think many things have changed in recent years, and I also want to give a plug for a little organisation called the Banking and Finance Oath. Chris Jones from it is here today, and look, it should have happened years and years ago. It's only happened relatively recently. It should be bigger than it is today, but it'll get there. What is it? It's basically, it's actually the idea of a whole bunch of Sydney people in the financial sector who said, we actually need to seriously introduce ethics into the finance industry. It's interesting, as I think about corporate life, 3 of us up on this stage are lawyers. I honestly don't use the law much anymore relative to the amount of thinking about those issues of judgment, ethics. As far as I'm concerned, it's just how are we going to get better over that longer term? And this Banking and Finance Oath is something that, as I said, it will ramp up, but we're asking anyone employed in the financial sector to pay a few dollars every year and be part of a movement that is across all the different corporates and players in the sector. We can, bash down those barriers and chew over some very tough issues which have just been raised by Vaz. There are sometimes no obvious or certainly quick answers, but there is no substitute also for learning from our peers right throughout the industry. How do we responsibly get to the bottom of some of these issues? And I think David is right. We will come up with different conclusions than to perhaps our peers of 30 years ago.
Just before going to the next couple of questions from the floor, David Thodey, it would have been more interesting if he had said he couldn't justify his salary when he started rather than when he's finishing. But I'm sure he's one CEO, none of his shareholders would begrudge what he was paid. The question to you is in terms of executive selection. Conversations with a couple of headhunters recently, both of them expressed frustration with boards who will tick boxes on their CEO selection, that boards are scared to look outside. And it was an off-the-record conversation, but there were examples given of a company whose CEO was failing, and so, we'll get another one, and we'll make sure he's just the same as the last one. It was put to me by one of Australia's top headhunters that boards are scared of the media. They are scared of appointing someone from left field, because they'll cop it from journalists, as if. But are you scared to step outside the box? I mean, probably the most successful retail CEO in Australia is Russo at Kmart, a hamburger flipper. Would any of you be game to do that?
Oh, hold on. I appointed Alison Watkins, who I think is absolutely fantastic. She came from Grain Corp. Now, I'm not going to tell you the secret formula for Coca-Cola, but I'm pretty sure it doesn't have grain in it. I actually dispute that, and it's interesting to think through which headhunters would have thought that. I think boards, because I'm not going to use them, but I think boards are quite adventuresome. But it's interesting, quite often if you appoint somebody from outside, the media says, why didn't you have somebody in succession within?
Yep.
So I think most of us decide we must do the right thing. We will never be praised for what we do, but maybe later on you'll get a David Thodey or something who's been so spectacular. And I think that board should be very proud of choosing him.
And that was an internal appointment.
It was.
So, and I think as a board that made a gutsy call on a 43-year-old ex-management consultant, certainly not afraid of looking outside the normal parameters. And yeah, as Kevin has said, we want to do the right thing and pick the person we think is best suited for the job. And if looking across and seeing somebody who's come from a non-traditional track looks like they'd be the best suited, let's do it.
Can I just add, many things have changed in governance, but one thing hasn't, namely the appointment of a CEO remains by far the most important thing a board does. And any one of us sitting on boards, if this is the year to choose a new CEO, wipe the diary, because it is increasingly, certainly with larger companies, a global exercise. Yes, there's sometimes a sense of embarrassment if we choose from outside, but occasionally that's the right thing to do. One should never limit the list. And yeah, look, I just concur with the other comments. To say it's a box-ticking exercise is so ridiculous as to be sad.
Yeah, see, those headhunters know nothing, really. Next question.
Nathan Fabian, I'm the Chief Executive of the Investor Group on Climate Change. Thanks for your time today. We always appreciate this session every year. And as a 43-year-old ex-management consultant, I absolutely endorse your comments there, Jane. It's amazing what you can find when you look. David, thank you for some of your responses on the climate issue, and forgive me, I'm going to take them up further. I was interested when you contrasted the clarity for you in a decision on tobacco versus the complexity in decisions around fossil fuels. And so I wondered if you might reflect on what made the tobacco issue clear and the climate issue unclear. And a cheeky follow-up for all of the committee here. David, you challenged us not to favour single